Everyone, welcome to another Book Review Wednesday, and today I am going to be briefly diving into my personal favorite book genres. I thought it would be interesting to do something different than what I usually do for these book reviews, and also I'm currently working on a book right now, and I may or may not be able to talk about that until next week because it is a pretty lengthy book. So without further ado, let me discuss my personal favorites, starting with historical fiction. Now, the reason why I think, in particular, historical fiction is rather fascinating is the fact that it's combining sort of real people or real events and sort of putting uh, an interesting spin on it by having it be somewhat fictionalized in various different ways. And I sort of like that angle of approaching books because they sort of highlight the important aspects that were going on during and within a period of time, but they do it in a way that's, again, not designed to be primarily within the realms of reality. And at the same time, they do provide some interesting historical commentary onto various things that have occurred throughout history and touch upon various interesting figures throughout history. And I think it's definitely safe to say that it's one of the more, I think, underrated genres, and it's technically considered sort of a subgenre because you have fiction as sort of a genre, and then historical fiction's a subgenre of fiction. But this uh, particular one, I think, appeals to me the most of the sort uh, of this, I guess, from one of the subgenres of fiction, this one appeals to me more so than some others because it tries to combine something that's, again, within the realms of reality, but then also blending in something that is sort of not necessarily accurate. But at the same time, not only do you get an understanding of the people and the environment and all of that within a historical fiction book, but you also get a sense of what the time period was actually like. Even though there may or may not be some historical inaccuracies here and there, you really do get to explore a whole new sort of world. And it's really interesting and fascinating to see how certain people sort of lived their lives within the various um, ages that they were sort of a part of. And I think it overall creates a lot of dynamic, or it creates a sense of dynamicness because you can explore various different time periods throughout history. You can focus on various important figures. You can even put in fictional figures into a historical setting, and there's just so much you can play around with, I think, as well. That's also something that makes me gravitate towards enjoying, in particular, historical fiction a lot. But I think those are definitely my reasons for liking that particular genre a lot. Second being fantasy. Now, I think what is really wonderful and fascinating about fantasy is the fact that you can sort of create your own universe and in and of itself your own kind of world where certain things operate in a variety of different ways. This is somewhat, I guess you could say, similar to science fiction, but the reason why I think I prefer fantasy is because it seems a lot more within based within culture and within mythos as opposed to science fiction that is just sort of second guessing certain things that potentially could happen within the future or or it could be a part of the future. Whereas with fantasy, you're taking a lot of elements that have existed sort of more so in the past, and you're sort of applying them and creating your own little dynamic uh, interpretation of a sort of again, world or universe. And it's really something that lends itself well to not just being its own standalone book, but also being a variety of different books. For example, the majority of like famous fantasies have not just been one particular book. For example, you have Lord of the Rings, you have Chronicles of Narnia, you have, even though I don't really particularly care for the Chronicles of Narnia all too much, you have Harry Potter. All of these fantasy books lend themselves to, again, being sort of set in that particular universe more so or not. And with what you can do with that is just so, what you can do with that is so vast and so expansive, and that it really lends itself well to being very creative and interesting. Game of Thrones is another perfect example of fantasy stories and books. So again, I think fantasy just lends itself to being its own kind of uh, genre within and of itself, because it just operates so differently from a lot of what we would consider fiction. And obviously it is fiction, but at the same time, it in and of itself, it establishes things in a way that is what we probably wouldn't just consider the sort of normal kind of everyday that sometimes is more prevalent in other genres. And fantasy often lends itself to various adventures and, you know, various obstacles and struggles. And I think that's just something that's so prevalent within the human condition, within human existence. And I think fantasy has sort of this resilience as well to it, that also I think lends itself well to being really interesting and providing great commentary onto various things that may or may not be obvious depending on how you look at a particular book that is fantasy. But I think that's really all I can say about that particular genre. Now, one of my other favorites personally is the classics. And by the classics, I mean stories that are considered to be of high caliber. Like, for example, books by Charles Dickinson, um, for example, Moby Dick, you know, all those kinds of stories that were written down in a lot uh, older times, and in do in and being written in those times, you really get a true understanding of sort of the time period. You also get some context into, you know, sort of what was going on or what the authors were sort of trying to say or express. Some of the stuff is obviously can be based within sort of more mythology and legend and whatnot. And that's also something that's quite fascinating as well about a lot of classical literature. And I think it's one that I think should sort of continue to be around. I think having those kinds of um, books that were primarily designed for, uh, I guess, the sort of um, were designed more so for the people of one particular time period, and having them being explored further and continuing to be explored further till today is, I think, very sort of important to understanding the sort of artistry behind writing and behind um, grasping various concepts and ideas and uh, different things that were sort of uh, essential to sort of build up the building blocks of um, books and of literature and of storytelling. Um, and these classics are really what got the ball rolling. Um, And again, this can stem all the way back from Homer, and it can go all the way up to the 20th century, because there is just so many that have come and gone over the years that have really shown to be classics in their own right. So I think it's definitely safe to say that it's one that I personally enjoy. And even though I gravitate more towards certain classic books than others, I can still get a sense of appreciation for what they ultimately try to convey to the audience and how they sort of really allowed storytelling to really progress over the years. And last but certainly not least, thriller / mystery. I really enjoy these kinds of stories because I think there's a lot of emotional grit to them. They're very intense and they offer a lot of interesting twists and turns. I think that thrillers and in particular mysteries offer good excuse me, offer good context into various plot points and to and uh, discuss various important character aspects um, that you don't usually see in some other genres. But I will say that what's interesting about this particular genre, at least, well, technically two genres combined into one really, thriller / mystery, is the fact that it's one where there is a more of an emphasis on it being more plot heavy. And again, obviously the characters play an important role, and it's interesting to see how they develop and how they're how they sort of play a role within the plot. And I think that's what really makes the characters, in particular for mysteries and thrillers, to be quite fascinating and unique compared to other genres where they're just kind of more explored as characters as opposed to their sort of role or place or their motivation sort of more within the context of the plot. And I think that's really what sets itself apart from some other genres, and why I think it makes it rather fascinating to read. But I think that's really ultimately all I can say about the particular genres I enjoy the most. But I'd be more than happy to hear what anybody else has to say and what they enjoy. But thank you so much for watching. I hope you all have a pleasant day, week, month, and year, and I hope to see you on the next video. Take care.